Boom. We are alive, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. Good friend and fellow podcaster, Miko Matsumura. Miko, how are you doing today? Great to have you
Just,
back.
yeah, just fine. Great to be back.
So, we've had a bunch of conversations over the last little while, and I've always appreciated your insight into, I guess, just broadly call it games and some of the stuff that's going on in venture capital and crypto. So this kind of merge between three of these very unique ideas. I don't have a lot of background with games, although I've been playing more, and I'm quite excited about just, I guess, how long standing the idea of games is. But one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show was A, we could catch up so we can have two stone birds effectively. And then also to dive into just some of the developments that have been taking place and what you see for the future of the cryptos. It's kind of just like a broad overview of what we'll do today. But Miko, just for fun, for anyone that's maybe new out on the channel today, you want to introduce yourself, your background, and
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Miko, and I'm a venture capitalist. So, my basic approach is, we have a fund too, which is basically a dedicated cryptographic asset fund. It's about 110 million USD. We invested our fund one into the kind of crypto bear market of 2018. So, we have a good, I think, basis, and we're kind of actively looking for projects. So, we look for basically really exceptional founders, ultra high conviction, and we look for opportunities to get in early. So that's kind of a little bit about us.
awesome. So that's obviously people will be able to tell some of the similarities of our interests here. I was quite excited. So congrats on the fun too. Um, what's some of the most exciting things that you've seen take place over the last, let's say, 6 months? Because it's been a while since we've touched base.
Yeah, 6 months it's been really I think kind of back to normal in some ways. Uh, I think during end of last year things were kind of nuts. So I think
Yes.
valuations were off the charts. The time frames were kind of insane. People were raising money and just instantly. And I think the thing, it's all pretty nice that it's that entrepreneur friendly, but I would say that, like, on the downside, there's a lot of low conviction activity, right? So it means that, like, it's founders with low conviction, investors with low conviction, everybody just throwing random money that they kind of randomly got from this casino. So, it really wasn't kind of builder centric. So, I really feel like what's happened over the past 6 months is, we've really gotten sort of it's a winter has both cold air and fresh air. So, it's really a breath of fresh air. I think things are much more builder centric now. And I think it's very rational. So I'm glad to see something that makes sense and that we can get behind.
Yeah, winters are usually much more quiet as well. Living here in the jungle, it's never quiet. If you've had people run around speakers trying to figure out where the buzz is coming from, it's like, "No, that's just the jungle." But the winter, like the northern winters, not only does it get slow, but it gets so quiet up there. Um, so this is one of the, I think, positive effects is naturally speaking, you know, making a good investment, it should be, some of it is random. Like some of these things I would have never been able to tell. Like Stardew Valley was one of these ones where if you'd showed me the game, I never would have been able to guess that it would do so well. I feel like I may have been able to spot other ones. What's some of these out, how do these outliers pop up? Like where's the one, how do you, yeah, here's how I ask this. How do you identify that randomness or the luck within the founders as well?
Yeah, I do think that that's actually fairly difficult, right? To be honest, right? Because when you think about it, obviously there's some games, in the game context, especially in the game context, because gaming is a hits business, right? So, like, the question becomes, how do you know you have a hit, right? So these days, when you look at kind of when you roll the credits on a big game, on like a AAA game, it's miles long. So there's hundreds of people working on it. They've been working on it for years, right? And when you think, like, for example, there are these really funky little runaway boutique hits, things like Among Us, and when they were building that game, they were probably not sitting around being like, oh, well, when there's a global pandemic and everybody's on Zoom, it'll be super awesome for them to play this game. You know, so like in a sense, there are absolutely factors that make a hit game that have to do with timing, and it's timing that's extremely opaque, right? So you know, if you're building a game, because they're a hits business, it's almost ties into things like fashion, you know, so it's almost like, well, what's really cool, right? And it's like, well, what's really cool right now? And what's really cool right now is different from what's really cool, like, you know, 6 months ago or 2 years ago or however long ago you started making this game, right? So in a sense, like, that's the complexity. I mean, obviously there's certain things you can look for. Like, one of the things that's really interesting are things like live ops. So like live ops is sort of the ability to dynamically deploy content into a game, right? You know, seasonal content, you know, Christmas content, or, you know, a celebrity can show up in your game. These are all things that kind of can really help make something contemporary or keep it fresh. You know, those are all, I think, pretty important capabilities. But, you know, ultimately, like, there's a certain amount of luck that I think is hard to escape.
Yeah, yeah, it's sewn into the fabric, it appears, or at least it is that. So probably more so to do with intention. Like, it's hard to navigate seeing the success, like CryptoPunks, the kind of natural effect of branding and that timing of the placement of the almost the cultural identity. Some of it reminds me of a religion to some degree or another, just this cultural identity and how people want to dress themselves or recognize from each other's like kin or whatever you want to call it. I guess the birds of a feather type mentality. Or so the reason why I asked this question is because that's what's excited me about this potential video game conversation, is that people are gravitate towards adoption of natural identity within the kind of the the metaverse space. I thought this is one of the big selling features to me for the people, at least, because I like it. I think it's fun. You know, I played around with NFTs and all this stuff. So the reason why I'm kind of leading this upwards is I want to ask a question about brand IP and value. How do you feel the relationship between let's say a token economy versus ownership of like first gen memorabilia, and its relationship to, I guess, brand IP? How do you share that? How do early participants grow with it? What's your thoughts on this?
I mean, I feel like when you talk about IP, right, you're really talking like, how do you separate, right? So in a sense, when you think about in the gaming context, right, like obviously when you think about like zero or first generation kind of NFT, a lot of it is sort of art, you know, so it's in a sense, because of that, it's sort of pure being, like it's just, here's an object, right? And the object really has no context, right? It's just an object. So you look at the object and you're like, oh, it's an object, right? Whereas I think in the gaming realm, it's more like moving into the realm of verbs, right? Where the object has a context and the context has a meaning. I think in the long run, the thing that will happen is that the object will have multiple contexts, right? So then, you know, you'll have a single object with multiple contexts, you know, and I think that will be the kind of like final steady state. But these kind of balance points between sort of being and doing, I think, are really, really interesting, and trying to understand the utility of something, you know, it's always a very contextual exercise, right? So, you know, if it's usable in one game or two games or five games, you know, then you know, it kind of potentially produces sort of a argument for the durability of the value.
Yeah, well, here's a thought. Here's a thought question. My favorite kind. I would try to look at something like South Park, or what if Rick and Morty had been launched in a more open context, where you kind of funded the direction of this creation based off a large participant's interest. Because you have evidence of stuff like this on GoFundMe, right? Where you can sell early prototype um, products effectively to fund the company. It's not a venture capital, right? You don't own anything in the company necessarily, but the NFTs are very unique aspects of digital ownership of IP. Is there a way to, I guess here's another way to kind of pinpoint it. Is there a way to, I guess everything kind of comes down to, is it a legal question or is it a code question? But how can you draw rights from IP into these characters on the long term? Is there a way to do that? Like if you and it's drawn within the brand. You know, we've seen things like Phantom Galaxies with the emissions based off the planets, Yeah, did that make sense?
I think we're
Sorry,
in
go.
no, it's fine. I think we're in very early days, right? Like, I think that when you think about the concept of rights, right, the concept of rights is largely a concept that is in the realm of law and not code. Right. So the idea of rights, right? So the thing that's very interesting about what's happened with NFT is kind of the crudeness of it, right? So the crudeness of it is that people have latched onto this concept of the right of ownership, and the concept of ownership is tied to basically all rights associated with an object, right? So in a sense, like it's this very crude concept, right? But when you really start to try to unpack the rights that come with NFT ownership, you end up with a grab bag. So you end up with a lot of complexity, a lot of ambiguity, and there's not a lot of precedent. So in a sense, there haven't been a lot of like legal actions around NFT ownership other than like regulatory action against fraud and things like that. But like broadly speaking, like there's not a lot of civil litigation track record, so like we don't really know, right? I think that the final steady state or the dream state is more kind of this metaverse interop scenario, right? So in a metaverse interop scenario, then what happens is that there becomes sort of like codifications of what you can and can't do that are adjudicated by so they're machine adjudicated by environments, right? Because then you get really reliability, right? So for example, you know like what does this sword do, right? And it's like, well, you have the right to swing it and hit stuff, and when you hit stuff, the game engine says that it does X amount of damage, right? So it's sort of like, okay, well, that's machine adjudicated. And in general, people they like to have rights like that, right? Because then it's a lot less messy. I think in a way, like that's the segue between this kind of very vague kind of law phase, and into the much more crisp code phase, right? Because I was talking with Steve over at Mechanism Capital. Comes from the Apple world, which is very IP controlling, and he comes from the App Store, right? And the thing that's interesting is his dream around blockchain is this idea of an internet that respects intellectual property, right? So the respect of intellectual property becomes kind of inherent as a fabric of the blockchain protocol, right? Which I think is kind of interesting. I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting lens because if you look at it that way, then it becomes the basis for the creator economy, right? Which is, that the creator is the initial owner, and then the rights are basically respected inherently by the code and the network. So it's not, it's I think I think the Blockstream people called it the don't can't be evil, right? So it's less kind of like I'm gonna do whatever, so sue me. It's actually more like, no, you actually can't do that.
Yeah, I guess there's just inherent aspects of the technology that represent ownership in such a unique way that's hard to obfuscate, even if there is a law, because the code itself represents one particular type of viable ownership for an idea. Whereas IP can be a whole bunch of things, like street art, effectively. Like, what are you going to navigate the control of someone's like painting of the particular RPs that you own or something on a wall? Doesn't make any sense. Like, there's abstractions of every imitation, I guess, to some degree. So I've been noticing more free to play versions of the play to earn games coming up. What's the next trend into adoption so that more people that like video games that currently seem to just not like crypto out of inherent distrust of the word, maybe, I'm not sure. Yeah, how do they make those first few steps into this kind of new pool of ownership?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, like if you think about the history of game digital assets, right? Like the free to play movement kind of has the best recipes, right? So the free to play movement basically has like how can something be free to play, right? So if something is free to play, then somebody has to provide economic input, right? And so people talk about like, oh, Axie is not economically sustainable or STEPN isn't economically sustainable, right? So like, but free to play is provably economically sustainable because we've been doing it for many years, right? So you either sell in-game items, you sell in-game currencies that you use to buy in-game items, or you show advertisements, right? Like so in a sense, like this idea, like take like the world's most popular esport game, League of Legends, right? Like how much playtime does a person have before they actually reach into their pocket and then they like buy a game, right? So like, if they actually buy like a skin, right? So the idea that they're buying a skin is a pretty big deal. So that's kind of my perspective.
See, the big difference though here, Miko, is if when you have just even ENS domains, like let's say you bought, I mean, when I bought a first ENS domain, I just one of the wallets, it dropped like at the height, it was worth like 15 grand or something for just buying and that you spent 30 bucks. So gamers don't have the experience of showing up, spending $30 on a skin, having that particular game they bought a skin in go up and then now be worth like 15 grand or something. They don't have any kind of visceral relationship with the growth of the brand that they're participating with. Like every single huge corporate conglomerate that grows on the backs of people's interest, they don't get to participate in any way, shape, or form with that growth. Like that's what I'm so excited about. It's like this is, people are participating in a way that's much more effective for each other, because that even the disintermediation of the middleman there is like, well, there's a huge amount of value left over. Like you pay taxes your whole life if you're a United States citizen, and they give you $1,200, lock your businesses down or whatever. But then you spend $30 on an ENS domain and they give you like 15 grand worth of ENS tokens. Clearly people would be way happier with an ENS like $30 investment. It's just compared with taxes for your entire life. You really don't get the same kickback necessarily. But so I guess to segue this into more of a question is, don't you think that the value feedback for the early I guess the gamers will be so high once they start to have the growth relationship, that it'll become, again, the game of going from like a $30 here to a $10,000 here. Uniswap, all you had to do was make a few trades. They gave you like 10 grand worth of tokens. So don't you think that user participate or that community participation feedback will drive such a higher leverage point for people that already play video games? Like
I
even though
mean, I would say that it's a mixed bag. I think if good games with good designers kind of show up, then I think that the economic value increases for everyone, right? But obviously there's a lot of fairly scammy things going on too, right? So, in a sense, just like letting everybody do everything, it produces kind of a mixed result, so I think that the classical kind of free to play model is one where trust is earned really, really slowly, and eventually someone will make a purchase, but they'll make a pretty small purchase, after like, thousands of hours of gameplay, they'll like maybe buy a skin, right? But I feel like, you're right about this idea of participation, and to me, like, the thing that I think is interesting when you look at technologies is that I think it's one of the reasons why the game technologies are so critically important to the evolution of blockchain, right? Because when you think about the metaverse you could think of as largely consisting of things like VR, AR, immersion technologies, right? Then there's kind of economic technologies like blockchain. And then there's kind of gamification, right? Which is sort of motivation and incentive technologies, right? So if you kind of look at the stack, the best way of looking at it, I think, is sort of answering the question of why, right? So if you look at like the VR tech, the answer to why is because it's new and interesting, right? So the thing that's really bad about that answer is that human beings habituate. So like after 2 weeks of something, it's no longer new or interesting. It's just the same old thing, right? So in a sense, the idea that the metaverse is driven by VR, I think, is bad. It's a bad idea because, that's because the reasons aren't there, right? So when you look at the reasons for gaming, the reasons for gaming are things like because it's fun, right? Now, that's quite interesting. It's interesting because people will definitely be drawn into doing things because they're fun. And I think that the fun is actually a way of keeping them doing things. So so to me, that's very interesting and durable, right? People will play a game for like months and months or even years, right? So like, and something like VR by itself without a game or fun, like it gets really boring, right? So that's an interesting thing. But when you go all the way down to the economic layer, there's sort of this notion of like belonging, right? And I think belonging is kind of the deep layer in the sense that like if you go to the metaverse and you think about it as something that's spatial, right? Then you have to go there, right? It's like you have to go to the metaverse, right? And ideally you have to live there. So it's like, well, why would we go and live in the metaverse, right? And the answer becomes because we belong there, right? It's because things there belong to us, right? So that's kind of, so it's like our friends and it's our family, it's our land, it's our game, it's our, it's everything, right? So in a sense, this kind of concept of belonging is something that I think is very deeply entwined in with blockchain technology, right? So I think if you kind of look at the stack for the
Yes,
metaverse,
it's
it
a
feels
force
like
multiplier
blockchain
for it all.
is where it's at.
Yeah, there's definitely a force multiplier for some of these aspects. The fact that the games make it fun is can in my mind I see it as the Trojan horse. I see it as it's a thing that can send the mycelium, where like the ownership technology far enough, fast enough. And it's one of the things that I liked about Axie, or what really caught my attention was this kind of it was almost a crisis asset. It functioned in the middle of a crisis for people, and I love stuff like that. It makes a lot of sense. I was to some degree, well, actually, here's the question. Have you played the Animoca brand's Benji Bananas, their little game?
I haven't.
Okay, I started playing that. They've got a membership pass. Just it's like $150 or something like this. And you play, and I think the first week I played, you played 10 games, something, got like $50 back. Now I know I already spent X, so like where's Y and Z come in? But that traction of people having being able to earn even like small amounts of purchase power is like $3 to $5 is a lot of money in some places. It can outpace wages. And I was super excited in 2017 about the kind of like post to earn projects like Steemit and stuff. Where how much is a brand worth? Why are community data points being sold for no benefit of their own other than to use this service? It's just such a one-way street between the participant. I think it's such a strong, like when you get it right, it just is so much more productive for the people that are part of the community themselves. So if games are largely built around this ability to have more community, and now the community is more vocal, louder, and better off connected because they're financially rewarded by participating together, it's like this perfect combination of success for some of these games, I think. Okay, so let's step away from the gaming bit and then just look at venture capital and blockchain kind of from a broad perspective. So we've seen a bunch of big funds step into this space, and I want to pose it to the question like this: Is Coinbase just a regulated pump and dump?
That's a funny question. I mean, Coinbase is an on-ramp, right? So, I mean, I think as such, Coinbase is providing sort of a valuable service and function, right? There's all kinds of little nooks and crannies to it. Like when you look at it kind of from a funnel perspective, it's fascinating, right? Because they have like, they have Earn, which provides education, and then ultimately, like they even have the Coinbase wallet, which kind of offers self-custody, right? So, I mean, it's interesting when you kind of look at it as an on-ramp, right? Now, I think gaming will be a bigger on-ramp, right? So I think that, when you look at something like, personal finance apps, right? Like when you look at things like mobile application stores, right? Like the personal finance category is dwarfed by the gaming category, right? So it feels like, as an on-ramp, I think games will be a much bigger on-ramp than, personal finance.
Oh, yeah, no, of course. There was just it's such an interesting one, and this is why, again, this is why I've liked this thesis. Is a lot of people don't even have personal finance. There's a lot of people that don't have real access to that. Like my gardener is clearly only using like one of those dead phones, right? He doesn't have a normal iPhone of any kind or any Android or anything. It's just like an old push button phone. There's no GPS location. This is an old Nokia phone or something. So there's a whole portion of the planet that just doesn't have access to any financial ownership, almost of any kind. They're just forced into so anyways, I kind of see games again as this Trojan horse so that we don't end up all using central bank digitally controlled currencies, Miko.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is kind of the promise of this sort of metaversal construct, right? Which is kind of related to Balaji Srinivasan's kind of concept of like nations, right? This sort of emergence and rise of a digital nation, right? So in a sense, like when you think about the idea of the metaverse as land, like it's a very odd kind of land. It isn't the kind of land that I would necessarily want to speculate or in owning and this kind of thing, simply really because it doesn't have scarcity, so you can always print more land. But if you think about it from the perspective of land, like it's a place where people go, and the question that arises is like, what are their rights? Like, what does citizenship entail? And what? So the thing that's kind of interesting when you think about financial services in that context is that it becomes kind of that true internet banking concept, right? That the protocol itself, like if you think about email as the post office of the internet, then things like Bitcoin become sort of the bank of the internet, and it really just resides in the protocol, rather than in any kind of like provider, any specific provider.
Yeah. So here's another way to look at the question too. What's your thoughts about the Starbucks and Polygon relationship? How will big brands try to utilize these participation tokens?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny. I mean, when I think about brands, it's such a funny concept in this emerging world, right? Because I think what's happened is that among the younger generation, I think we have the ascendancy of influencers over brands, right? So in a sense, I think that the concept of brands, I think, is sort of forced to evolve in this world, and I think that um I think they're all going to be forced to adapt. So, I think use of these kinds of decentralized technologies, like in a way, like it's them. Like if you can't beat them, join them. So I suspect that that's where this whole thing goes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I, I, I guess part of the thought process there too is just, companies have been using their market budgets horribly wrong. Why even spend any money on marketing? Just find out who your customers are and give them money. It's the best marketing you could almost ever ask for. People be so, I was so upset that crypto.com was trying to take that lady that they accidentally gave $10 million to court for. It's like, just write a story about her. She should like give her more crypto.com swag. Like you guys are doing this PR thing totally wrong, guys. It's people like memes like this. This would be fantastic.
Yeah,
Um,
just skip buying a stadium. Just give it all to that lady.
well, these, this, uh, okay, well, my favorite would be Red Bull, right? If you get a clearly profitable company, they spend like a few $1 billion on marketing every year. I wonder to myself, okay, if you had the collection of the X amount of people that have bought your product over the year, you had like you're managing their tier section, and you just gave away $3 billion that year instead. Like if you went on Twitter every day and like our good job is to give away $3 billion, that's our marketing plan. Oh my God, you'd have one of the biggest Twitter accounts on the planet. It'd be ridiculous. So part of me wonders why companies haven't got noticing this more direct to consumer route. And one of the things that blockchain provides is this kind of direct to community ownership route. I'm kind of baffled that people don't do that with these bigger brands. Um, so what are the most interesting things you see being built out there right now? Who's being the most successful?
Yeah, I mean, it's early to say in this particular wave, right? I think to me, the thing that the future definitely belongs to, the builders. But I would say that like we're still in early innings, right? So I would say, pointing at someone and saying, oh, they're being successful, like, obviously there's ups and downs.
Right. Yeah, okay. So no game winners at halftime. Yeah. Well, that's a fair one. I know this, I guess, by nature. Um, what's been the most intriguing, the thing that you would have least expected to be successful and is still now today successful?
It's funny, right? It's funny because when you think about things that are counterintuitive, I guess one of the things that is really interesting that um kind of makes you kind of scratch your head is kind of this creative destruction, right? Which is when you see this kind of bearish sentiment, the thing that's so intriguing becomes that it appears right now that there's a kind of a huge wave of what I think of as sort of disingenuous copy pasta, right? Which is, there's a lot of EVM chains, so you can basically just do this cross-chain copy pasta. So there's lots of it, right? So like if you just take some code like Uniswap 2 and you just bring it onto a different EVM chain, right? Then you're like the biggest thing in town, right? So, the thing that was very fascinating that I saw this morning was some research kind of talking about sort of global drops of TVL, right? And when you look at where the TVL is, like, it's really still almost entirely vested in, Ethereum. And then like from there, it drops sharply to everything else, so it's really interesting to think about because despite this kind of cross-chain copy pasta being sort of like everywhere, it's kind of only nominally or marginally successful, right? So the thing that I think is interesting when you think about it is from a venture perspective, there's not much to do, right? Because these kinds of incentives are, the cost of doing it is very low, and the conviction is also therefore very low, right? Which is if that's what you want to do, it's probably a better thing to do than to like buy a McDonald's franchise, but it's not a venture business. So I guess to me, I'm kind of musing at the sort of quote unquote overnight success of the kind of millions of, disingenuous cross-chain copy pastas that have popped up.
Well, yeah, over time, you likely get some level of Pareto distribution, just naturally speaking, I would assume. I look at human survival and I go, okay, well, we've been able to survive. That's like kind of like the destiny. It ends up being a very small number of things that do survive, because over time, as we saw, everything's being destroyed. There's this kind of peak into creative destruction you mentioned. Like being able to survive itself is actually like, whoa, that's pretty impressive. This is kind of one of the numbers that I was reading this MIT paper around how you might invest into scientists. Is it better to pick the best ones, people with a track record, or is it best to just invest a specific amount in each of them, or just pick 10 to 30% of it at random, basically? And then the most effective route was just to basically invest in all of them equally, because in those early days, it's almost impossible to tell. But over time, you get these really strong indicators. Ethereum has done fantastic. And what will make it change, I guess, is a technology layer. What's your thoughts on Aptos and these much larger venture raises in technology before it ever ends up in like the community layer?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this is it's definitely a natural, right? It's natural because there's just a ton of venture capital money in the space, right? So, I do think that it's natural that if you're super strong, then your goal will be to find things that are super heavy to lift, right? So like, layer ones are super heavy to lift. So like, if you show up with a very technological looking layer one, then you're likely to get like cosmological amounts of venture capital, right? So, I think that from the perspective of the native technology, like if you look at Miston Labs and you look at the Narwhal Tusk consensus layer, like I think it's quite cool. It's definitely like a valuable contribution from a technical perspective, but I think the place where I think it's more interesting is more from the move layer, which is, I really feel like there's room for innovation in the developer layer with kind of second generation smart contract environments. I feel like Solidity is good for what it is, but I think it's not a final resting state because it's a little bit like low level coding in C++. Like there's just a lot of ways to just blow yourself up, and I think when you're handling money, blowing yourself up tends to be less fun. So like, I think that, obviously there's been lots of efforts to kind of create systems like formal verification, or, there's lots of different kind of mindsets around how to make it harder to blow yourself up. But I would say that like, that's an area where there's tremendous opportunity for innovation is in kind of the developer layer.
So, I don't know much about the development stuff. I usually just looking at the broad spectrum concept and trying to catch that wave in general. One of my questions there was, is this because Solidity is written in the Turing complete language, which is a bit more open source versus something that's like Rust, where you have a high degree of, or a higher number of more focused programmers specifically who have time spent there, as in comparison to learning this kind of new variable or new arbitrary language?
I mean, there are definitely people who argue about things like Turing completeness, right? Like, to me, when you think about Turing completeness, one of the inherent properties of Turing completeness is effectively the halting problem, right? So, the halting problem is basically because the thing that's really complex about software is that you don't really know what the inputs will be, right? So if you reason about the halting problem, if you have kind of a Turing complete computational device, then effectively you don't know if it's ever going to halt, right? So so the result of it becomes incentivization of models like gas, right? Because if you put something into an infinite loop, then you can pay an infinite amount of gas, right? And that kind of creates incentives for people to not make infinite loops, right? Because obviously, the world has limited resources for things like code execution, and obviously, networks have limited execution resources, right? So how do you then prioritize the execution of things, and generally, and there are reasons, sometimes legitimate reasons for having loops that kind of appear to be infinite. Things like game loops are infinite for the purpose of the time you're playing. So I would say that, like, to me, when you kind of reason about that element of it, I don't think the Turing completeness or incompleteness is necessarily the key issue. But I do think that it does relate. I mean, some people do try to win by like restricting and creating kind of more limited expression. I don't think that's necessarily like the answer. I think there's another branch that isn't about limitation of Turing completeness, but it's more about formal verification. If you look at that family of things, like Agoric has a really interesting approach, which is they're not really doing formal verification, but they have this mechanism of security assertion. So security assertion basically allows you to say, well, this module is secure, in the following way. So you can kind of declaratively assert security, right? Which gives you then composability, right? So if you snap together things, and you can kind of remain calm about what's expected to happen with respect to a specific module, right? So these are all kind of different approaches, but I think ultimately, the thing that becomes really interesting are kind of, how do you provide assurances? And what are the important assurances to provide? And I do think that, the idea that there are very specific hardened pieces of code that require specific assurances, I think is a great approach, because, people know what they don't want to have happen.
Yeah, well, sometimes no.
I mean, they're just not that articulate about being able to describe it until it's already happened.
Well, yes. I mean, so this is one of the things about risk or learning, probably in general, this idea of, okay, well, how does one, through intelligence, navigate something? It usually is through mistake. Like most of it's mistake. It's by many mistakes, usually finding something that works. Like, oh, great, well, no more mistakes, just the thing that effectively works. Okay, so I want to ask one more question, which is around the merge for Ethereum. How do you feel about proof of stake, I guess? What's your thoughts here?
I feel like this is like, there have been several generations of proof of stake in the wild, things like, Tezos or these other kinds of proof of stakes. They're sort of distributed. There's all kinds of different types of proof of stake models. And like, I think if they were bad, they would have been taken down. Like there's plenty of value that's flowed across proof of stake. And if, the scale of incentives given to attackers to crack it is large enough that if it were easy to crack, it probably would have been cracked. I know that that's kind of like it's sort of a proof by known absence, which I think is a weak proof, but I because it's possible that they've all been hacked, but that nobody heard about it, which I think that's probably unlikely and hard to do in the context of a blockchain. You would have to have the person who's wallet got cracked, stay quiet about it, which people do, but I would say that largely speaking, it feels like these systems have proven themselves over time. So, so for me, I feel like that's one of the reasons why I'm less urgent on fixing consensus. Like, I feel like people are like, oh, but you need performance. And I'm really kind of like, but what performance do you need that you're not getting out of like an L2? So,
Yeah, it's I guess one of my innate worries is just about the manipulation. Okay, do you feel that? Oh, here you go. Here's a question. What do you think? I don't know this one actually. Is proof with proof of stake, you can pretty much just outweigh it if you have enough money, right? So the real question comes down to, do you have enough economic power to move the needle on that machine, more or less, right?
yeah, I mean,
Inherent danger, isn't it?
yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, I think that people who are sticklers for this would definitely rather be protected by sort of thermodynamics than
Okay, here's it.
protected by
Well, here's
game
it.
theory, right? But I would
Well,
say that like even Bitcoin, which is supposedly thermodynamic, is still protected by game theory, right? Because uh like Bitcoin is provably attackable at 51%. So if someone has like a godlike amount of money, they can just buy all the hash power and then attack the network, right? So even Bitcoin has an implicit proof of stake mechanism in it. So I would say people who are suspicious of it, I think in general, we'll probably experience a Joker attack in our lifetimes, but like in general, like I don't think we the thing what I hold is I hold that complex open systems tend to collapse, and the bigger systems tend to collapse in larger ways, right? So in a sense, like when you think about decentralization, you think about disingenuous copy pasta, like when you think about kind of how complex blockchain is and how fragmented it is, that's probably more of a feature than a bug, because it just means that the inherent tendency of things to collapse is really limited to the largest possible collapse that you can create, right? And so if you have biodiversity, then you can just take out the biggest species and all the other species keep humming along. So that's kind of the broader mindset around like decentralization.
oh yes, no, I totally agree. That choice is in the name of the game when it comes to decentralization. You actually need and would expect all of that copy pasta to some degree, and it's part of like the biodiversity effectively of the ecosystem, for better or for worse, but just a natural part. Um, any other fun things that's happened this last? Oh yeah, here, I mean, we saw some crazy blowups. I never would have expected Three Arrows Capital or any of these other guys to go down. What's your thought about because we haven't talked for a while. What's your thought about the blow some of the blow ups?
Yeah. So I think that this is all endemic, right? It's all endemic in the sense that, like, the thing that's so amazing is that there's kind of a big cohort in crypto that's kind of been thirsty for legitimacy, right? And the kind of hallmark of legitimacy is kind of re-centralization, right? So there's a certain tribe within crypto that's like, okay, let's re-centralize all the things, and once we've done that, then crypto will have made it, right? Will be, and so in a way that becomes, centralized crypto versus centralized non-crypto, right? But in a sense, like, to me, the whole motivation for the crypto world is, in a sense, it's an admission that systems just do fail, right? So,
Oh,
the
good.
idea of decentralization, the idea of biodiversity, the idea of kind of this complexity is kind of just a natural response to sort of the endemic fragility of like systems at scale, right? So I think this idea of like, oh, well, system X is too big to fail, therefore it won't fail. Like it proves that, like, that's provably wrong, right? Like the idea that something is too big to fail is more like a it's more like a statement of we wouldn't want it to, but it doesn't, there isn't a way to so far that I've seen to make systems that are immune to failure.
Yeah, it was one of the thoughts I had around the idea of like a stable anything. But you're like, oh, it's a stable coin. Well, technically, none of these currencies are stable at all. There's no such thing. Everything changes. It's like it's so silly to think that we have things that could stay stable. It doesn't exist in nature. There's no stable thing. Given enough period of time, they all blow up. Everything gets blown up over enough time. Like it all gets smashed in by space rocks. Like that's where it's all going, ladies and gentlemen. So you can't escape kind of the inevitable story of the stars at the end of the day either. You actually you mentioned this. Do you know the story of Phaeton? You'd mentioned the kind of the story of the father and the son's and the
Yeah,
wielding of.
yeah, driving the sun chariot. Yeah, it's
Yes.
definitely that sort of they're sort of echoes of the story of Icarus. Like they're, in a way, I think the echoes are more to do with kind of this there's a little bit of hubris that goes in both stories that kind of results in the great fall.
Yes. Well, and in Phaeton's story too, when Solon tells it to Plato, he tells it as a precursor to Atlantis. So I think the implied like mythology is about space rocks. I think Phaeton is supposed to be a giant space rock, this kind of like shining star that comes in and hits the planet, kind of wipes everything out. I don't know. I guess
Yeah, yeah,
just
yeah.
in,
And just for the audience's sake, like, basically, Helios is driving the sun across the sky in a chariot, right? So like basically Phaeton is like the son of Helios, so he basically took the sun for a joyride and basically like burned everything, including himself.
it
So
crashed it straight into the earth.
yeah, it was definitely one of those like Wile E. Coyote coming out all blackened kind of moments. It definitely is. The Olympians do that from time to time.
Yes, very very interesting tales of that story, or how it got to today. Well, Miko, it's always a pleasure to chat. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. A full hour of conversation. Nice. I appreciate that. It's always fun. I always enjoy the learning process. Um, Give us a thumbs up. Write your comments, questions, thoughts down below. Miko's Twitter and his website are also there as well. Be sure to give him a follow and a shout out as well.
Terrific.
And Miko, yeah, just stay on and we'll chat again here just